Support for this podcast comes from listeners like you. This is an ad-free show and donations are greatly appreciated. To learn more and make a contribution, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. It means the world to me. I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, the power of acceptance. I am so excited to share this conversation with you, which I enjoyed immensely. It's exactly the type of conversation I like having on the show. My guest today is Seth Gillihan. He is a licensed psychologist, author, and host of the Think, Act, Be podcast. His books include Retrain Your Brain, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy in 7 Weeks, A Mindful Year, and Mindful Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. His work has been featured in the New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, WebMD, Psychology Today magazine and blog, Everyday Health, and the Waking Up meditation app. Hard things happen to all of us. When we resist, when we constantly fight to change things, wishing they were different, we generate more suffering. When we let go of resistance, we lessen our suffering. When we accept things as they are with mindful awareness and open-heartedness, we find ease, comfort, flow, and peace. We need to learn how to identify when it's time to persist and when it's time to accept. We also talked about silver linings, finding gifts in hardships. Seth shared a simple mindfulness practice for grounding, very memorable practice that I actually use in my life. We discussed his framework, Think, Act, Be, and how he applied it to his own life, the role of self-compassion, and more. I would love to suggest a couple of past episodes that I think go well with today's conversation. 2 of my absolute favorite episodes from our archive. The first one is episode 296, Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation. I know it's a mouthful, but the content in this episode is truly powerful. It's with author Bruce Tift. He wrote the book Already Free, a phenomenal book. I read it multiple times and I highly recommend. The second episode that I want to recommend is episode 269, Forgiveness with Dr. Fred Luskin. Again, don't go by the title of this episode. The content is truly life-changing. I hope you'll check them out. And now, please enjoy this delightfully wonderful, thought-provoking, and powerful conversation with Seth Gillihan. Seth, I am delighted to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Anna. It's great to be here.
Well, I just finished your book just in time for this conversation. I want to ask you to take us back and paint a picture of a day when you were feeling ill and you had symptoms, you were not feeling yourself. What was it like as a person, as a father, as a partner, as a professional? Give us the taste and flavor of one day. How was it for you when you were struggling?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Anna. And actually, I feel a lot of emotion as you ask me to think about those things. Yeah, that I know I've known this. There's some unprocessed content from back then, we might say. So this goes back a few years, but typically, so let's say, a typical day, I would probably wake up at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, unable to go back to sleep. And so I'd usually get out of bed and, work from maybe 3:30 till 6 or 6:30 or so, just doing writing things or reviewing things I was working on. And it was a kind of bizarre shadow existence. I feel like I was existing in this in-between world where, nobody else was really up at that time. I was delighted when I found out that one of the locations of the gym that I went to opened at 4. I was like, oh, thank God, I can go and pretend like I'm just here for an early morning workout. I'm just like a normal person, not, struggling and confused. And so I'd usually be all right for the first part of the day. And then, I'd go to work where I was seeing therapy clients all day. And I remember walking to work pretty much every morning during that period and just being like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I can't do this. I was dragging myself because my energy would start to fade, as the morning went on. And then I would maybe see a couple people and then I have to take a nap at some point because I was so exhausted and I was having all these physical challenges that I didn't understand. And doctors couldn't really explain, every specialist is like, oh, yeah, your brain looks fine. Your heart looks fine. Your labs look like mostly okay. So at the end of the day, usually around, 3, 4, 5, I just want to be done. And when I finally was, I'd sort of stumble home. Like I couldn't walk I would sort of drift from side to side on the sidewalk. It was hard for me to walk in a straight line. And just my legs felt like I was wearing lead boots. I'd walk up these tiny hills and just be like, oh my God, I'm so tired. Like in a way that I hadn't been in my life. I'd been like worn out from doing, a lot of work or something or from exercise, but not that kind of just like hitting a wall where it's just bizarre. Like, why am I struggling to walk up this little hill that my like 2 and 6-year-old kids are just, like floating up. So I'd get home and it's telling around this time, she was probably 6 at the time. She's 12 now. She has a knack for naming things. And she started to call my persona at that time Mad Dad because I was often just irritable and I just had no patience. And there's still, everything left to do in the evening with our kids at the time were probably 2, 6, and 9. So we were kind of in the thick of it there. And, they required a lot of hands-on work. And I'd come home and I made dinner every evening. And I just, I'd sit down just like, shell-shocked by the end of making dinner. And then there was the whole routine afterwards, getting them ready for bed. And at that point, I just felt done. There's this refrain that would often come to me that I describe in the book. I feel like I've come to the end of myself. I've come to the end of myself, my own resources for coping. So that was where I found myself. I was really depressed. I often had thoughts of wanting to die and believing, at least a part of me really believed that my kids would be better off without me, that they deserved a better parent, not a better version of me, but someone different from me. And so thankfully I didn't act on that. I have a history of suicide in my family. My dad's dad killed himself when he was about my age, when he was 47. So yeah, that was kind of where I found myself around the time that I started, I guess a little bit before I started writing that book.
Wow, that's pretty dark and heavy, even when you describe it. I mean, I read it in the book, but when you describe it, I see your facial expressions and I can see your gestures. It's still very, I feel the emotions coming through and it's like really affecting me. So are you symptom free now?
No, thankfully the depression is mostly gone. I mean, I have ups and downs like everyone does. And, some days are harder than others, but the health stuff has gotten much better. Some of it, you never really know these things. And once you exhaust kind of the possible explanations from mainstream medicine, then you get into, sort of the next level of things like, oh, is it is it dysbiosis? Is it a gut health thing? Is it, stuff that medicine, at least for now, doesn't really take seriously, or much of medicine. So it seemed like exposure to toxic mold was probably part of the picture in the office where I'd been, my clinical office. But I got out of there and I felt better, but not great. And then a couple of years later, I got a diagnosis of Lyme that had never been treated, which is, just such at this point, like almost a cliche. Like I hear people describing their health journeys on podcasts and I'm like, I know where this is going. And then they found out it was Lyme. So I haven't really ever been treated for that, not in never had antibiotics. But for whatever reason, whether diet related or just, really managing stress in my life, I'm doing much better. I don't have the same sense of desperation. There's so much sort of almost obligatory acceptance that's come out of these, past, at this point, 6 or 7 years, where it's like, what am I going to do? I can't rail against this forever. Like at some point I just need to live as best I can with life and my health as it is. So thankfully, most of the time I feel really positive and upbeat, and I can go on a walk in the morning and even have energy in the afternoon to go on a walk. Again, it's not like before when I seem to have endless energy, did triathlons and all the things I described in that book. But thankfully, the physical stuff is much better, but that second layer, the depression, which was just, such a heavy weight, thankfully that is really not a big part of my life anymore.
Interesting. So you've come to accept it, and your relationship has shifted towards it, towards your illness or towards your condition. But it's interesting how the acceptance of the physical seems like it's a lot easier than the depression part. It's just so heavy, I guess, the depression part. No matter what you do, how are you going to accept that? I also find that with physical stuff, you have to eventually accept, like I have several conditions, things like that I haven't talked about on the podcast. But so eventually you accept, because there is no solution and there's only prognosis, and it's pretty bad, but it's not happening now. And if you worry about it, there's nothing you can do. You just have to wait and see. And it's a very awful place to be. But at some point, I find that peace comes when you don't battle with it. You're at ease and at peace. Not that you're denying the reality of things. Of course, it's there, right? Like I have a condition. I know it's there. And this may happen to me, at any time. But what am I going to do now? Right? I can't just curtail my life and sit in the dark and wait for something bad to happen. I still have to move on and live my life and be happy and grateful with having that uncertainty.
Yeah, and I appreciate your sharing that. You also, it sounds like what I'm describing, the struggles and the uncertainty. And I don't want to, I've realized, Anna, there are times I've listened to interviews that I've done, and I sort of unintentionally seem to give an impression of like, yeah, I used to, be frustrated with my health, and now I've made peace with it, and all is well.
No, that's not what we're saying.
No, because that's true sometimes. There is that just surprising peace that's available, even when my circumstances are exactly what they've been. Like, okay, nothing's really improved maybe in some way, but I'm not fighting against it.
That's it. Yeah, you're not fighting against it. I think that's what it is.
That's such that changes everything.
You're not sitting there and saying, why is this happening to me? Of course, we go through that. And I think I don't want to say normal part of it. Of course, it's part of it. When you get a pretty bad diagnosis with an awful prognosis, you are allowed to curse God and things and bitch and moan and complain and whine. But there is an expiration date to that. I think if you're going to be in that state, is not so helpful, then you're going to affect your own mental health yourself, and there is no shortcut or fast path to getting to acceptance. I think we all have our own journey, but I feel like that happens if we let that resistance go, if we don't say, why did this happen to me? Why me? Why me? Why can't it be better? Why can't I breathe disease-free, right? I think that's not helpful.
No. All the upward comparisons, like, look at all these jerks living their lives with, no concerns. And obviously it's not, when I think about it, it's not actually true. Like everybody has struggles that we don't know about, but there's so many difficulties that I've never experienced, that I struggle with. I used to be able to run. I can't run anymore. I can't lift weights very well because my body fatigues so quickly. But there are people who can't, do so many things that I can do. So it's helpful if I remember to ask why me in the other direction. Like, why am I so fortunate, to still have so many abilities? And because nothing said that I should, nothing said that somehow I'm immune to the types of difficulties that other people have had.
What do you think of like when people say, oh, there is a gift in it, or there is a silver lining? I know what you think about this because I read in the book. I want you to share with the listener.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. One is it really matters who is saying it and in what spirit they're saying it. When I get that as a, like a first or an early response to something, like someone's like, how are you doing? I'm like, how are you doing? And if I'm honest with them, because I think they want to know, and then they say, well, but you still got whatever, or like, yeah, I bet you've grown from it. And sort of like, yeah, but you're skipping past a lot. You're kind of doing an end run on all the stuff in between. And in a way that kind of, I mean, and I get this, we want people to be okay. And so we want to find automatically, I think we want to find a way to help ourselves make peace with this person's struggles and say, like, oh, yeah, well, you're having a tough time. Well, there must be a consolation prize. So that I don't think is helpful. And I think most of the time, it's really only helpful to have that realization for ourselves. Like, oh, there have been good things that have come through this. It's just a fact. Like most of the time in our lives, the hardest things that we go through, there are also positive things that come about because of that, or we're forced to grow in some way. And so it would be kind of out of step with reality to deny those things, but also it'd be out of step to, as you were suggesting, to pretend that these things don't affect us, or it was just a gift, like it was just a positive. But I think, yeah, to acknowledge, without going into toxic positivity where we're not allowing ourselves to experience things as they are, also to not be stuck in the negativity, that this is just bad. Kind of like, I mean, I found this with COVID too. I felt bad for a long time mentioning any of the positives because I knew so many people were struggling and that just wasn't their reality. But there have been lots of discussions at this point about how there were positive things that came from, all that, those struggles and the shutdowns and everything.
I feel like when you're going through it, it's hard to see those gifts, quote unquote. Time has to pass. You have to be out of that experience, maybe even having processed it, like to look backwards in retrospect and say, this was a gift. This is what I learned. This was the lesson. But when you're in it, I think it's such a bad message to receive from people. I think another reframe I have, and I hear this in the spiritual world, is what's the teaching here for me, right? Instead of seeing it as a gift, not everything is a gift necessarily, but there is always some kind of teaching, or what's the growth opportunity for me. I tend to see it through that lens as opposed to this is a gift, this is a silver lining. And I find that from my life, at least I have to be out of that experience many, many, many years. Like what I went through in my childhood, I only can see the quote unquote benefits or the lessons that I learned now. But if you were to ask me then when I was going through the traumatic experiences, believe me, there were no gifts. And I don't wish this upon anyone. So I think the wisdom comes after the trauma, after the experience. And there is no way of, rushing people to get there. Our loved ones, we may have good intentions. We may be so enlightened that, oh, you're going to be, feeling much better one day and you're going to see the gifts in this. That's not what people want to hear.
No, and yeah, it's definitely not helpful. And it does, yeah, it's like trying to fast forward past the reality of what's happening. And there's something else I was going to say about that. But do you ever have two thoughts in mind and then they kind of cancel each other out and you can't remember either of them?
Yes.
But yeah, just that idea of having that idea that our difficulties are gifts. It seems like it can lead to a sense of guilt about like what's wrong with me, that like I'm stuck in, I'm feeling sorry for myself. I'm pissed off. I'm sort of withdrawing from the world and I'm not out there like, turning this, spinning this straw into gold and turning my difficulty into a positive message for others and becoming a motivational speaker or whatever. But around this time, I don't know if people still do this, but there were a couple of years there where choosing a word for the year was a thing.
Yes, it's still a thing. I still do it for the podcast too.
Oh yeah, yeah, I like that. And so at the time when I first learned about this, the word I picked was steadfast because I've always liked that word and liked the sense of kind of equanimity that it contained. But I felt some guilt or shame around, steadfast to me had this idea of like, I just need to be, constant, like no ups, no down, not really, but steadfast felt like I'm kind of unaffected by difficulties, by trials. But then what I came to see being steadfast as not that you never fall down, but that each time you do, you get back up. Like that's what it means. You keep coming back. You keep coming back. Because again, there's that false kind of ideal of like, oh, I should just be above it all, and kind of elevating the spiritual above everything else and denying, really, I think denying our full humanity as if like we're just these ethereal beings and that's what it means to fully actualize.
It's funny when you said motivational speaker. Recently, I get so many pitches. I'm sure you do too on your podcast. Somebody reached out to me and they said that there is this author who writes about grief and loss. We would think he would be a great guest for your show. And these are my, favorite topics to cover, to talk about, to think about. And then I read the description carefully. A father who lost his children, his teenage children in a car accident. Literally like even a year hasn't passed. Now he's talking about grief and motivating people. He's this inspirational speaker. I looked at that and I'm like, no, thanks. I don't think this is the right time. I don't feel right. Maybe he can inspire people. But then I heard an interview somewhere else. And I mean, how can you get up and be a motivational speaker if this terrible tragedy just happened to you within a year? I think you need plenty of time to reap lessons or teachings, to be enlightened in order to share with people. That's where I stand. It felt too soon. And so I declined that. But also what I want to say is I think self-compassion is so useful in those instances, in order not to have that guilt that you're talking about, but to look at the situation and instead of saying, why me? Why this disease or this illness? Why this condition? Why do I have a child with autism? Why? But just extending self-compassion for our condition. I find it's the biggest tool that any parent or any person can develop, especially in those moments, to see the common humanity. Yes, I'm having this hard time. This is a difficult condition or situation. And other people are going through this too. And I'm not alone. And I know that can be hard too for people. But I think I'd rather direct my attention practicing self-compassion in those moments than being stuck in denying the reality, because that can lead me to acceptance faster.
Right. Yeah, I know it's a paradox, isn't it? That by accepting I'm not okay with this right now. I'm not ready to find a silver lining. I'm just upset, or I'm really having a tough time here. That can, really help us to find self-compassion, which I found, as I described early in the book, I think that was really what I was discovering, at that point where I felt like my own resources ended. It was like I felt it was still me, but there was like another layer of me that could observe my experience and extend me that type of understanding and embrace and really even kind of a source of strength that was beyond kind of my ego-based, sort of small self that was so focused on like my life is not going very well right now.
Yeah, I remember that moment in the book when you are at Cape Cod looking at the ocean and thinking the Moana movie.
That's right. Yeah, Cape May, but yes.
It was quite powerful to read that part.
Have you seen the movie? Did you see Moana?
Yeah, I've seen the movie years ago when it first came out. Yeah.
Yeah, and our kids were super into it at that point. And yeah, great movie anyway.
It is a great movie. I want us to talk about this acceptance piece a little more. I find that, there are so many gifts that come with acceptance. Do you find that I have this idea? I'm not sure what your thoughts are on acceptance. I find that I need to grieve whatever it is I need to accept in order for acceptance to happen. I cannot accept something without grieving another thing, right? Like I am going through this health condition. This is going to happen, but I need to do a bit of grieving, cry and mourn the loss of what will never be, what I'm losing, what's coming, right? In order for acceptance to happen. I don't think just saying, just accept things as they are, that's never going to work. I find that grieving is a prerequisite for acceptance. So I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I love that, Anna. I also love how when we talk about these sort of phony or misguided ideas of acceptance or mindfulness, like we both take on a kind of dreamy, like not real type of voice because it doesn't feel real. But I think I know what you're responding to, that idea, that sort of myth about mindful acceptance, that somehow it leapfrogs over our pain and in a way kind of pushes away certain experiences, especially certain emotional experiences. Like, oh, you're depressed. Well, maybe you're not mindful enough, or like, oh, you're feeling anxious. You need to be more mindful. Why are you sad? I thought you practiced meditation. But more and more, my own understanding and practice of mindfulness is so much just about allowing, just allow yourself to have your experience, allow yourself to like what you like, allow yourself to not like what you don't like, and don't force yourself to do things you hate. There's an idea. And don't cut off certain types of experiences because they don't fit some sort of idealized cliche about what it means to be mindful. That's the farthest thing in my mind from what an actually helpful practice of mindfulness is about, which is about being more human, being more of who you are, not sort of dissolving into this angelic being who is like not human. Like that's really what makes us human is all of it, the whole mess. So anyway, all that to say, yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. That, I know this, some people have a strong reaction to like Christian related things. I've gotten some feedback on my book about, there's a lot of, what people call God talk in there, talking about my own like background as with my religious upbringing and then, bringing in some Bible verses at times when they're relevant. And so I understand this may not resonate with everyone, but I think it's instructive on some level to see that, like in the Bible, for example, that's the religious tradition that I'm most familiar with. So many of the Psalms are about like, God, this sucks. Why would you let this happen? Why me? And then there are these other ones, like those ones don't last forever. That's like all of what the Psalms are. It's a lot of it. And there's a whole book called Lamentations, like weeping and tearing garments and, wearing sackcloth. So yeah, I think that's all very much a part of being human. And the people we love the most are usually the most human, the most fully three-dimensional people.
I think that's that place, if we can find ourselves and allow ourselves to be when we are in those times when we need to, what did you say, rip our clothes? Or I think if we can just be in that place for long enough, acceptance will come. I think most people want to bypass that or just not experience, and understandably so, right? It's hard. It's not easy. But I find that unless you go through that dark tunnel and be stuck there for a while, whatever that while is for your pain, for your situation, acceptance will come. You don't have to do anything special to create conditions for acceptance. Acceptance, will be on the other side of that dark tunnel,
Yeah. I always think of just keep backing up your frame of what you're making space for. Like you feel like I can't be mindful now because I can't be accepting of this. Then like we can allow our awareness to envelop that resistance too. Like I don't feel like accepting this right now. All right, I can open to that. That's where I'm at right now. And so you're never outside of acceptance if you're just allowing what is to be what it is, including your resistance.
Yeah. Well said. You write about alignment, connecting to yourself, coming home to yourself. And also, your background is in CBT. I find that after reading your book and knowing you based on your podcast, obviously, that I feel like you're not a hardcore CBT person. You're more of the mindfulness type of person. But nevertheless, I want to ask you about Think, Act, Be, and how did you apply to your own condition when you had that realization moment and things started changing for you? Did you go step by step? Did you say, I'm going to do think first, then act, then, obviously not. But can you talk about the journey?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I can give examples of where each of those, where I found them really helpful.
Yes, I think that would be perfect. Yeah.
Well, thankfully, I had enough experience in, as a therapist to know that, beliefs about like, oh, my family would be better off without me, that those were always, that's never true. There's never a case in which what your family really needs is your suicide. Like, that's just not true. Even if you're having a lot of conflict, like that's not going to be a positive thing in their lives. So realizing that, like, okay, I know, like, there's definitely, like, it really feels true, but I knew that, that's a kind of emotional reasoning. Like, it feels true that my family needs me to end my life, but I recognize that in reality, that's not actually the case. So obviously that was very protective. Also, when I was able to, challenging some of the shame-filled thoughts that I had about my condition, like, God, what a screw up I am. Like, I'm sick, I'm having all these health struggles. Like, what a loser. Like, what's like really taking it personally. That was helpful. I do find, I described this in the book. I think there's this image of, if you're trying to, let's say, remove snow, after a blizzard, like, you can do it with your hands, but that's really difficult. It helps to have a tool like a shovel. So I think of the like cognitive work, the think part of Think Act B, as kind of like a snow shovel. Like, it's much more effective. It can do a lot more good with it than without it. But at the same time, it has its limits. Whereas mindfulness, I feel like when you can apply it in a way that's actually helpful, it's kind of like the spring thaw. Like, it can really, you're not kind of having to go, like shovelful by shovelful as you, deal with all these thoughts. You can, maybe it's more of a overarching relationship with your thoughts. And so they no longer carry as much weight. So I found that there's a real peace that can come with mindfulness doesn't depend on anything being different than how it already is, but, just changing that relationship to how things are. And it's just, I hate to use so many superlatives because I don't want to oversell it, but it is hard to overstate what a difference it can make to just be open to your life as it is and to let go of that internal sense of no, like, no, I don't want this. This is bad. I reject this. But recognizing, like, yeah, life is difficult at times. You're going to struggle. You have struggled. You'll have more struggles. Everyone has difficulties because we're human. So that mindful acceptance part to me was a huge deal. And then the behavioral, yeah.
Can I interrupt for a moment and just ask, were you by that point already practicing meditation, mindfulness? Were you immersed in that world? Did you have experience?
I'd been practicing meditation for a few years at that point, probably since around 2010 or so. So probably for, 7 or 8 years.
You know why I'm asking this? Because if I think what you're describing works for people who already have experience with mindfulness meditation, who have that experience. I think to a person who has zero experience, and it's no matter what, I think it's hard for them, even for us who practice mindfulness meditation, that mindful acceptance is still difficult, but it can take place, but we can observe our thoughts and blah, 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 all those mindful things. But I think for people who have zero experience, that's a really, really struggle to develop in the, like right away when you're going through this hard moment. Can you rely on this tool? Well, if I haven't used that tool, or I'm not even aware that tool exists and what the benefits of that tool could be, I think that's really not only challenging, but it could be also shaming, guilt-inducing. How come I'm not good at this? I think we need to be clear on this. I wonder, what can you add to what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree. That's right. Because even for people who have practiced meditation and mindfulness for years, it's still a struggle. So even just to remember like, oh yeah, that's also an option. I can also practice acceptance. Oh yeah, forgot about that. What a relief. Yeah, so I think meditation, I compare, trying to, like, some people just want to do like the in the moment mindfulness. I'm just going to practice being mindful of, washing my hands and talking to people and walking, and all that is great and can be great practice. But I think that you can really get a kind of concentrated dose of what mindfulness practice is about by doing a more sort of distilled version of it, like with meditation, for example, like a seated meditation. There's so few external distractions. So it's probably an easier place to start and to practice and then to use it in the easy times in your life, and then eventually, to have it there when you need it. I don't want to overstate the point though, because I also think that there are these insights we can have that can be applied really quickly. So an example that I give, I forget if I wrote about this, but I had a yoga instructor, and I hadn't taken much yoga at this point. I'd, taken just a handful of classes. But she said in one of the classes, your breath is always available for you as, a place to ground and to come back to, and you can use that at any point. And so, I don't know, a year or so later, maybe the next few months after that, we were in the delivery room, and, my wife was giving birth to our second child, and there's a lot of stress around it, around the baby's heart monitor and, the progress of the labor and everything. And so thankfully in that moment, I remembered what my yoga instructor had said, and I found tremendous peace in the breath in a way that I could come back and actually be present, and be there, with and for my wife. So that was not, years of practice or even months of seated meditation. It was just an awareness of like the breath is a tool that you can use. So I think there's different ways of seeing it.
I agree with that breath is always available. Breathing is always available to us. We breathe all the time. And by just shifting how we breathe, we can create change in our nervous system, as opposed to doing mindfulness or meditation, which could be hard for a lot of people who have, an alarmed stress response and overactivation, trauma, whatever in their body. I agree. The breath often is a tool that we can rely on, especially for people who can't practice or access mindfulness, right? People have a hard time just sitting and being there. That could be traumatizing.
Yeah, I should clarify though, it wasn't just do breathing exercises. It was allow the breath to, or come to the breath in order to allow you to open to what's happening. That was really what shifted it for me.
Say me more than about that experience. Like, how did that change you? What did you start doing? Did you start paying attention to how you breathe? Or
my memory of it, it's been 12 years now, but almost 13. My memory of it is that it's like, okay, I can, notice my breathing. And then that allowed for enough, like, and I didn't do any specific, like in for 2, out for 4 or whatever. It was more just like, all right, notice you're breathing in, you're breathing out. And then I realized I could let go of the struggle against, like I was trying to make everything work out. I have to like sort of mentally try to control this outcome. Obviously I didn't have that kind of power. So that's a huge stress and false sense of responsibility. But I could let go of that and be like, all right, like something's going to happen here. Like I hope that it goes well, but I don't have to try to control that. So it was the breath really was a cue for a more kind of open, mindful acceptance.
I see. Okay.
It felt like a gift. Like that felt like a total gift, because it wasn't like I knew all about that and I was like, oh, I need to invoke that. It was more just like it sort of arrived, like I think often does. But I think a crucial point that you raise is that we don't have to feel bad for times that we don't do this, or if something isn't usually accessible to us. I think that's the way things are.
Let's go to the ACT part of your framework and how you applied that to your situation.
Yeah, so that was really, so much of depression is, well, it's related to the things that we do, not always, but there's so many studies showing that what often tends to happen is that for one reason or another, our lives kind of get shrunk down. We pull away from activities that are enjoyable or things that are important that we need to take care of. And we need those types of activities in our lives in order for our moods to stay not like always positive, but in like a healthy range. So I just took stock of my life and thought about what I was filling it with, and some of it was just sort of junk, like I was spending more time on social media at the time than I really wanted or thought was actually helpful to me, or probably even more than social media, just like checking email. It's like constantly like, oh, let me check email. Oh, and let me check the news. Nothing that really satisfied, just sort of that filler that electronics have become in our lives, probably most of the time. So I thought about my life and what I'd like to be doing more of. And I thought gardening, I'd like to expand my garden. And so I spent a few months, really focused on that. And then that led into the whole, spring and summer and fall of gardening. And there were other things too, trying to see friends more often and get out of the house more. But that physical activity and just the engagement of building a garden was a huge part, I think, of what helped me to come back.
It's such a symbolic metaphor for life, vitality, and growth. I love that. How about the third prong, B?
Well, that was really through the acceptance that I found.
So that was in the beginning?
Yeah, I think that was really foundational. I mean, I've kept it think, act, be, like in that order, but I think the B really for me has become kind of primary, you know.
I can tell, yeah, but you're sticking with your cognitive behavioral therapy roots. You're not, and it sounds catchy, right? Think, act, be instead of be, think, act, like, right? It's catchier that way.
Yeah, I think at this point it's mostly just the sort of phonetics of it. You know, probably most people are, but I'm sensitive to that kind of thing. Or it's like I would not have ordered those words that way. You know, like what if you just switch this around? It just, ending on a vowel just seems to work so much more nicely. But
when you talk about the be part, because think, act, be is the feelings part in the be goes under the be?
Yeah, interesting question.
Because like I'm reading your book, I'm like, wait a second, where are the feelings here? Okay, the behavior part, I get it. Cognitive part, I feel it. Mindfulness part, I feel it. But when is the time when we feel our feelings, right? I'm mindful. I have a lot of feelings. I have a lot of anger, overwhelm, sadness, sorrow. Where does that go?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think part of the confusion I think that think act be can create is that, think, that's thought. So it sounds like it's describing our experience, things that we experience. Oh, I experience my actions. But what it's describing are interventions. So there are cognitive things you can do, there are behavioral things you can do, there are mindfulness practices you can use. We wouldn't say they're emotional. Emotions are something that we experience and that we can do things that might affect, but emotions aren't an intervention themselves. They're an experience that we have, just like, maybe this is a bad comparison, but nausea, for example, it's an experience, but we would never tell someone like, we use nausea as a tool to do this, so any of those, I think our thoughts, our feelings, and our mindful presence all can act on our emotions. But the model really is about, it's kind of the level of interventions.
Yes, it does. Yeah, tremendously. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What I would love though is the CBT triangle, thoughts, feelings, and actions. So think obviously goes with thoughts, action goes with behavior. I would love it if it doesn't map on. Mindfulness doesn't map on to feelings because it encompasses all of our experience. So it would be cleaner, I think, and like more elegant if it all aligned in that way. Thoughts, feelings, actions went with think, act, be, but it's not the world we live in. B, I think of really as the context, it's kind of the ground that everything else then is a part of.
Mm-hmm. And I love there was a practice, very simple in the book, right in the beginning, I think, where you breathe in, you say, I am, you breathe out, you say here. I really thought that was very simple, but very powerful, and it stays with you and you can do it over and over. It speaks to that breathing insight that you had at the delivery room.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. I just coincidentally, just yesterday, I was going somewhere and I was late. I wasn't late getting there, but I thought I might be late. There's a transportation issue. But anyway, I'm on my way from the first to the second floor in the elevator, with all this kind of stuff in the background. This happened before I got there. And I ended up, I thought of that exercise and just did that on the way up in the elevator. I'm just like, all right, whatever's happened before, I am here. I'm here. This is where I am. This is where I am now. And yeah, it is a nice kind of simple practice that can be helpful at times.
What do you find useful for your own life? Like, what do you practice these days? You said stress management, self-care, and things like that. If you were to give me like 5, key things that you practice on a daily basis or on a regular basis, can you share with me?
Yeah. So, well, I would say, this one is now just so much just built into my life, but, I've had to be really deliberate about my nutrition. So, a healthy diet is a big part of the foundation at this point. Making sure I get outside every day. Like I went for a walk this morning with a good friend of mine. We do this loop at the college nearby us, the Harvard College Nature Trail loop. So, some kind of like moderate exercise, like walking, maybe a little bit of weights or some yoga, stopping work at a reasonable time. These days, usually like 4:30 or 5. So I have, time to make dinner without feeling, stressed. And I don't know if you know that there's this feeling of when you've reached the end, like your mind and body are kind of saying like, that's enough for today. Like, can we just stop? And for so long, I would just push through that, and find myself overextended and worn out and irritable and stressed. So I'm really trying to listen to that at this point. Well, related to getting outside and going for walks, spending time with other people, really trying to build that in, time with friends, time with my kids as they're getting older. And then I guess the last one would be sleep, trying to do what I can to have as much good sleep as possible. But that's up or down, but it's, again, much better than it used to be. Most nights I'm getting 6.5 or 7 hours of sleep, which was not the case when I was up and writing at 3:30, 4 in the morning.
I find that at our age, I'm 1 year older than you. I find that I was talking to a friend just yesterday, and another friend who's going through health conditions, just like like she went for MRI, she went for this. There's no absolute reason, why you should be having these symptoms. But so we were having this conversation about our health, and I'm like, yeah, we lived half a century on this earth. Like, I mean, I said, just imagine the experiences that we accumulated. Like, we have this whole history for almost 50 years of trauma and stress and adversity and challenges. And most of them are unprocessed. We're carrying this heavy load of unprocessed stuff. And of course, as we age in our 40s, it's no coincidence that our afflictions or these health issues are surfacing like that, And it's a really bad time, as most of us are raising teenagers, which is difficult. A lot of women go through perimenopause or menopause, which is hard. And a lot of people have aging or dying parents. It's like, this is the worst age to be, the middle age, like late 40s. It's like everything just comes together, perfect storm, for a perfect storm. Can we just be understanding and extend self-compassion that, normalize this experience, that yes, you have anxiety and depression. That might be because you are perimenopausal, or childhood trauma. Like I said, I mean, we have so much accumulated stuff that, of course, it's going to come and bite us in the butt, at some point in our life. Like, we can't just hide from our stuff or carry it.
I think, yeah, it's so true. You hear so many people talking about, like around 40, 42, whatever, like all of a sudden, things weren't working so well. It's funny because I was laughing this morning. We were walking our youngest daughter, to school, and talking about this issue with the bathrooms. There's been, conflict over the bathroom in the morning, people getting ready for school, getting ready for work. And I was just laughing because I was like, this is such a cliche. Like, what family has not had conflict over the bathroom in the morning? It's like the stuff of sitcoms. It's like everyone experiences this, and yet it feels so specific and personal. And I think that's just like a small example of almost everything in our lives. It feels like, oh, it's me. But then if you zoom out, like, you just happen to be the human who's having that experience. It's like a kid going through terrible twos. It's like, oh yeah, they're so difficult. Like, yeah, because they're two. Like, that's what happens. It's like, why am I struggling with my health? Well, because lots of people do. Like, why? Oh God, why is my mind thinking those things? Because that's the type of thing that minds think sometimes. So I'm really intending at this point just to take my own experience less personally. Like, that's it. You're human. You're a part of the whole deal, because that's what happens to humans.
Yeah, true. It's hard when you're in it. It's hard to see that larger picture and the common humanity. I think this is why I feel like self-compassion is the most important tool that we can cultivate. It could be so useful in so many situations: parenting, conflict, relationships, health. Yeah, so we're not stuck in our own misery and self-inflicting other things, like that second arrow you talk about. I'm already struggling, right? The struggle is real. It's already there. Is there anything else you want to say that I didn't ask? I know we, talked about other things in the beginning. Is there a message, a quote from the book, or in general that you want to leave the listener with? There was any point in our conversation that you want to highlight? I don't want to end like this. I want to end with something punchy.
Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing that I want people to take and to remember, I think it's directly related to what we were just talking about around self-compassion. And that is to just be kind to yourself, to offer yourself a little bit of kindness. It's okay to treat yourself as if you're someone that you like. I know it's not easy, but I think just remember that, self-kindness is okay. Like, give yourself a break.
Yeah. Give yourself a break. You deserve it. You deserve it. Yeah. And you can handle the situation. We're not saying, be permissive, where you're getting off the hook,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You just don't have to be hard on yourself.
You can go through the experience, but you don't have to be hard on yourself. There's a big difference, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No advantage really to being mean to yourself. Not that I can think of.
Yeah. No, that there is not. Just be with the experience, I think. Grieve, cry, acceptance will come, or accept the things, but don't do it by berating yourself or being hard on yourself, because that's not going to change your experience. In fact, it's going to exacerbate.
Right. And if you berate yourself, that's okay too. Don't beat yourself up for berating yourself.
And the cycle can continue. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your calm wisdom, your presence, how much you shared in the book about yourself so bravely. I commend you on that. I think it's not that easy. Being vulnerable on a podcast is fine, but putting it in a book is like, it's a whole nother level. It's there.
Yeah, people can look back and read it again. Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for writing the book, being here. I hope I will have a chance to invite you back again to talk about something else.
Great. Yeah, I would love that, Anna. Thank you so much for having me and for all your great questions.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What is your main takeaway from this conversation? What resonated with you? I would love to hear from you. As always, you can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And yes, I do prefer audio. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners from around the world, engage in meaningful conversations about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for people like you. If you haven't already, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast on the platform that you listen. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and elsewhere. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.